While she was pregnant, Mandy met Frank, and the two quickly fell in love. Before long, she gave birth to a baby boy Frank accepted as his own. Frank was a decent, honest man, so he never hesitated to take responsibility as the father. But after they married, Mandy seemed to become a completely different person. She spent hours getting ready every day, and stayed out all night, rarely bothering to come home. Meanwhile, Frank was left alone to care for their newborn. Day after day, his resentment built, until Frank finally reached his breaking point. He followed Mandy to a bar, and the moment he walked inside, he saw her casually wrapped in another man's arms. Even then, Frank tried to control his anger, hoping she might offer some reasonable explanation. But what hurt even more than the betrayal was Mandy's complete indifference when she came home. Her mocking laughter pushed Frank over the edge. In a burst of rage, he shoved her, sending her stumbling backward, and striking her head against the hard fireplace. The fall killed Mandy. Then, a drop of cold water landed on her forehead. Frank suddenly snapped back to reality, and remembered the baby was still upstairs in the bathtub. When he rushed in, the infant was lying motionless in the water, no longer breathing. In a single night, Frank lost both people he had tried so hard to protect. The court found him guilty of murder, and sentenced him to 18 years in prison. The uncertain young man he once was gradually hardened into a weathered middle-aged prisoner. Then an emergency appendectomy unexpectedly gave him a chance to escape. While recovering, he jumped from a second-story hospital window. Cornered and desperate, Frank approached Henry inside a department store, and used the boy to pressure Adele into giving him a ride. At only 13, Henry did not fully grasp the danger. He simply believed the injured man in front of him needed help, so he led Frank over to Adele. Not knowing who the stranger was, Henry even introduced him to his mother. Adele studied the exhausted man standing before her, but the cold intensity in his eyes immediately filled her with fear. She wanted to get away from the situation as quickly as possible, so she claimed they had an important appointment that afternoon. But before she could finish, Frank tightened his grip on Henry's shoulder, and calmly told her she had no choice but to help him. With nowhere to turn, Adele reluctantly complied. At the checkout, the strain on her face caught the cashier's attention. Still, Adele was too afraid to signal for help, fearing one reckless move could lead to consequences she could never take back. Once they were in the car, Frank pulled Henry into the back seat beside him, and ordered Adele to drive to their house. The entire way, Adele was paralyzed by fear. When a police siren suddenly swept past them, Frank broke into a cold sweat, and Adele's heart began pounding just as hard. She kept imagining slamming on the brakes and calling for help, but the danger was impossible to predict, and she could not risk it. Torn between panic and uncertainty, the three of them finally reached the house. Frank scanned the rooms around him, and the place reminded him of the home he had lost. While he looked around, Adele quietly took a small knife from a drawer, and hid it behind her back. She kept it as a last resort to protect her son. But what happened next was nothing like she expected. Henry noticed Frank's injuries, and could not resist asking how he had gotten hurt. Frank did not try to hide the truth. He plainly told the boy he had been injured jumping from a second-story hospital window, and that the hospital belonged to a prison. At that moment, mother and son finally understood. The man they had brought home was an escaped convict. Adele's heart nearly stopped. She nervously poured him a cup of hot coffee, but her trembling hands gave away her fear. Frank noticed immediately, and immediately recognized how terrified she was. He lowered his voice and promised he would only stay until evening, just long enough to rest and tend to his injuries. During that time, he would do whatever he could to help them, and would not cause any more trouble. But to Adele, there was no reason to trust the word of a convicted killer. Frank seemed to read her mind, so he added one more reassurance. Even so, a promise like that, coming from a complete stranger, was hardly enough to earn her trust. Just as the tension between them reached a standstill, an urgent news bulletin suddenly appeared on television. The anchor's grave voice made the room feel airless, and every word described Frank as an escaped convict, who was extremely dangerous. While repeatedly warning the public to remain on alert, Henry immediately turned toward Frank. Young as he was, he understood that hiding a fugitive could bring serious trouble down on his family. But Frank had already thought that far ahead. Before either of them could respond, he proposed a way to protect them. If they were discovered, it needed to look as though Adele had been kidnapped, so Frank tied her to a chair. That way, if the police came, Adele and Henry could prove they had not helped him willingly. Adele hesitated for a moment, then reluctantly nodded. Only then did Frank pick up the rope, carefully secure her wrists, and avoid using any unnecessary force. He did not pull the rope too tight, and deliberately left the knot fairly loose so Adele could free herself if she had to. She was still frightened, but she began to realize Frank was not exactly the monster described on television, and slowly started to calm down. After tying Adele up, Frank headed into the kitchen, while mother and son watched him with suspicion. He opened the refrigerator, selected a few ingredients with practiced ease, and began making dinner. His knife work was clean, his control of the heat was precise, and every movement was calm and confident. He did not look like a man on the run. Instead, he looked like someone who had spent years cooking for a family. Before long, the rich smell of food filled the kitchen. Frank carried the finished meal to the table, picked up a spoon, gently blew on the food to cool it, then carefully raised it to Adele's mouth, and fed her one bite at a time. The unexpected tenderness left Adele both surprised and unsettled. Her hands were still tied, but she did not refuse the care he was offering. For one brief moment, she felt as though someone genuinely cared about her. Henry was even more astonished as he watched. He knew better than anyone that, after their family fell apart, Adele had sunk deeper and deeper into grief and depression. Most days, she could barely bring herself to speak to a strange man, yet now, she was allowing an escaped prisoner to take care of her. But the warmth of that moment did not last. Late that night, Frank gently untied Adele, and quietly said he had to leave. He did not want his problems to make life even harder for a mother and son, who were already struggling. But when he reached the door, he saw police still patrolling outside, leaving him no safe way to escape. With no other option, he was forced to remain in the house, and wait for a better opportunity. The next morning, Adele walked into the dining room, and once again felt an unexpected warmth. Frank had prepared a full breakfast for both of them. At the table, Henry held the newspaper, unable to take his eyes off Frank's wanted photograph, his face filled with curiosity. Before Henry could say anything, Frank calmly told him, "I don't blame you for being curious, but remember one thing, the papers never tell the whole story." Henry then asked how he had escaped from the prison hospital. Frank patiently walked him through everything that had happened. Henry, in turn, told Frank about the hardships his mother had endured for years. Long ago, Gerald had walked away from their marriage, leaving Adele to carry the entire burden alone, while raising Henry, all while living with wounds that had never truly healed. After hearing this, Frank could not help saying, "Your father was a fool to leave a good woman like her." As soon as he finished, Adele stepped out of the room, still holding the rope from the night before. She handed it to Frank herself, wanting to preserve the appearance of a kidnapping. But Frank shook his head, and said it was no longer necessary. He had no intention of keeping Adele tied up, though the rope still showed she had once been restrained. Besides, he had not heard the morning train, probably because of the Labor Day weekend schedule, so he would have to wait longer before leaving town. With Henry encouraging her, Adele slowly picked up the breakfast Frank had made, took a small bite, and was surprised by how good it tasted. In that instant, a feeling she had buried deep inside herself for years quietly began to awaken. To repay them for letting him stay, Frank took it upon himself to handle almost every job around the house. He began repairing the broken steps outside, securing the loose floorboards in the living room, replacing the shattered kitchen window, and even clearing away the leaves that had been piling up on the roof. He also taught Henry practical skills, demonstrating each task while reminding him not to wait until something was completely broken before fixing it, especially when there was a woman in the house. It sounded like a casual joke, but the lesson quietly taught Henry about responsibility and consideration. While working on Adele's old car, Frank specifically called Henry over, and with the patience of a father, guided his hands through changing a tire, while explaining every step. Whenever they had time, he played baseball with Henry, constantly correcting the boy's grip and the motion of his swing. always gently and never with frustration. Watching from nearby, Adele nearly forgot Frank was still a wanted man, and even began wishing these quiet days could last a little longer. She took out a needle and thread herself, and mended the frayed cuff of Frank's pant, but before that warmth could settle in, a rapid knock at the door immediately put Frank on edge. He slipped behind the door, ready to pretend he was holding Adele hostage if necessary, then signaled Henry to answer it. The boy forced himself to remain calm and opened the door, only to find Mr. Jervis carrying a basket of homegrown peaches. He also warned them that a prisoner had escaped nearby, and told them to keep every door locked. Henry accepted the heavy basket. Only after the door closed did he finally let out his breath. Frank sincerely praised Henry for staying so composed, but Adele immediately pulled her son aside, her anger impossible to hide, then turned on Frank. "My son is not your lookout, and he is certainly not your accomplice. I won't let him get dragged into this danger." Frank frowned and replied, "Don't forget the situation we're all in." Adele started to answer, but ultimately said nothing. The mood inside the house instantly grew heavy. Just then, Frank casually picked up a peach and took a bite, and its sweetness filled his mouth. His eyes lit up. "That is one sweet peach." Adele explained that the peaches were already fully ripe, and would spoil quickly if they were not eaten soon, but there was no way 3 people could finish an entire basket. Frank studied the peaches and suddenly had an idea. He offered to make Adele and Henry a peach pie. It was one of his specialties. So the 3 of them went into the kitchen, with Frank taking the lead, and showing Adele and Henry how to mix the dough, roll out the crust, and prepare the peaches for the filling. Flour drifted softly through the air, and the scent of peaches mixed with freshly worked dough, turning the kitchen into a warm, picture-perfect scene. They looked exactly like a family of 3, making dinner together. The kitchen was fairly small, so Frank and Adele had to stand close, and their hands kept brushing by accident. Each time it happened, Adele felt her cheeks grow warm, as an emotion she could no longer hide began to take root. When the peach pie finally came out of the oven, its golden crust was still steaming, and the sweet aroma filled the entire house, chasing away all the tension that had hung over them before. In that inviting warmth, the bond among the 3 of them quietly deepened. Frank naturally settled beside Adele, until almost no distance remained between them. Without thinking, he slipped an arm around her waist. Adele froze for a moment, but she did not pull away. Instead, she gently rested her head on Frank's shoulder. Since separating from her former husband, it had been years since anyone had held her that way. The tenderness made her want to remain there. That warm embrace also filled the empty space in Frank where a family had once been. But reason kept reminding him that every second he stayed placed Adele and Henry in greater danger. So Frank decided he would leave that night. Neither Adele nor Henry wanted him to go. Adele urged him to wait until his injuries had fully healed, and Henry quickly added, "They are not going to stop looking for you, and they have dogs that can follow the blood trail. Wait until your wounds heal before you leave. Just stay here." Their sincere plea broke through the last fragile barrier around Frank's heart. In the end, he agreed to stay. That night, Adele finally let down all her defenses, and she and Frank began speaking honestly with each other. Secrets buried for years, and feelings suppressed for far too long, finally found a place to be expressed. 2 lonely people offered each other warmth in the darkness. Henry also began to accept that this man might become part of their new family. Around noon the next day, Frank suggested grilling something for lunch, and asked Henry to pick up ingredients at a nearby store. But on his way home, Henry saw police posting wanted notices along the road, and the face on every flyer was Frank's. His chest tightened. When he reached home, he was so shaken that he forgot to close the front door. At that exact moment, a neighbor arrived. Henry rushed outside to stop her, terrified that she might discover Frank. Fortunately, Adele stepped out in time to explain. Evelyn said her father was critically ill, and asked Adele to watch Barry for a little while. Barry used a wheelchair, and had difficulty communicating, so he needed someone nearby. Adele tried to think of a reason to refuse, but Evelyn kept pleading, and she finally agreed. Though reluctantly, she brought Barry into the house, unable to shake her anxiety. Frank, however, did not seem bothered at all. He cheerfully approached Barry, and invited him to join their baseball game. Frank patiently guided him, helping Barry hit the ball alongside Henry. The 3 of them laughed and played in the yard. That afternoon gave them a sense of ease none of them had felt in a long time. That evening, Evelyn returned for her son. At that very moment, the television in the living room was airing another report about Frank. Barry seemed to recognize something, so he tugged at his mother's shirt and tried to speak. Adele's heart leapt into her throat, and she barely dared to breathe. But Evelyn assumed her son was simply fussing, and quickly apologized, embarrassed that Barry could not yet speak clearly, then hurried him out of the house. The immediate danger had passed, but Adele's fear and uncertainty continued to grow heavier. If things continued this way, it was only a matter of time before something went wrong. She desperately wanted a new life with Frank, but Gerald would never agree to let her take Henry away. Henry overheard everything from nearby, and his heart immediately sank. Was his mother going to leave him behind for love? That night, he tossed and turned without sleeping. The next morning, Adele asked Henry to find books about Prince Edward Island at the library. While he was there, he unexpectedly met a girl who immediately caught his attention. Eleanor had recently moved to town, and was living with her father. She told Henry that her mother had a new boyfriend, and had sent her away to live with her dad. Henry understood what it felt like to be pushed aside by adults, because a new man had also appeared in his home, and was now living with Adele. He was afraid he would no longer be needed. Eleanor told him that when adults fall in love, they can forget their children and want a world of their own. Instead of reassuring Henry, her words made him even more afraid that Adele and Frank would abandon him. When night fell, Henry opened the door and stepped inside, then froze at the sight before him. In the living room, Adele and Frank were gently dancing to the music. The energy of their growing love made two people once worn down by life seem radiant, as though they had become years younger. But the warmth of the scene only made Henry's fear more real. He did not want to interrupt, so he started to slip away. But Adele noticed him. She stopped dancing, and gently but firmly told Henry that the three of them planned to move to Prince Edward Island, Canada. English was spoken there, and at the time they would not need passports to cross the border, so they hoped they could start over. Henry's eyes immediately filled with tears. He asked whether he would ever see them again. Heartbroken, Adele pulled him into her arms, asked why he would ever think that, and promised they would never leave him behind. Frank gently rubbed Henry's head as well, and solemnly promised he would never abandon him. At last, the fear hanging over Henry began to ease, and a relieved smile appeared on his face. The three of them decided to leave the following morning for Prince Edward Island. While they were packing, Henry suddenly remembered something, grabbed his coat, and ran out of the house. He wanted to see Eleanor one last time, and say goodbye. When he found her, Henry lowered his voice, unable to hide his sadness, and told her he was leaving the next morning for Canada. Eleanor paused, then cautiously asked whether the man staying with his family was the fugitive they had seen on television. Henry instinctively tried to deny it, but under Eleanor's steady gaze, he finally nodded, trusting her to keep the secret. Eleanor remained silent for a long moment, then suddenly stepped closer, and kissed him. She promised not to tell anyone, but then pressured Henry to go further. He became uncomfortable, and refused because he was not ready. Eleanor mocked him, and said she would find another boy instead. The encounter left Henry even more confused by feelings and expectations he was not prepared for. Meanwhile, Adele remained full of hope for a peaceful life with Frank, but on the night before their departure, Frank's injured leg suddenly became swollen and infected. Without immediate treatment, he would never endure the long trip the next morning. There were no medical supplies left in the house, and Henry still had not returned, so Adele had no choice but to drive to the pharmacy herself. But the moment she sat behind the wheel, her hands began shaking uncontrollably, and a nameless fear immediately swept over her. Frank noticed that something was wrong, and gently told her that if she wanted to change her mind, there was still time. What he did not understand was that Adele's real fear was losing the happiness she had only just found. Gerald, Adele's former husband, had always wanted more children. After Henry was born, the two of them repeatedly tried to build a larger family, but fate kept turning against them, and 3 miscarriages gradually broke Adele down. During her final pregnancy, she carried a baby girl to full term, but the child was stillborn. The repeated losses left Adele buried in grief, and Gerald did not have the strength to remain beside her. That was why Adele feared Frank would eventually leave her too. Tears streamed down her face as the painful memories returned. Frank pulled Adele tightly into his arms, and gently tried to quiet her fears. That evening, the three of them finished finished packing, and prepared for the journey ahead. Henry wrote a goodbye letter to his father, then slipped away to leave it at Gerald's house while Adele packed. But on the way back, he ran into an unexpected problem. A patrol car happened to pass by. Officer Treadwell saw Henry walking alone in the rain, and noticed how tense he looked, so he offered him a ride home. Henry quickly refused and insisted he was fine, but Treadwell would not let the boy continue walking alone. With no way out of it, Henry climbed into the patrol car. When the car pulled into the driveway, Adele's face immediately went pale. Officer Treadwell approached the house, and noticed their car packed with luggage. Adele hurriedly explained that she was taking old belongings to sell. Treadwell offered to carry one of the boxes inside, leaving Adele no polite way to stop him. As he entered, he quietly studied the house, while Frank hid to avoid being seen. In the end, Treadwell left without discovering him. From his hiding place, Frank silently watched everything unfold. Only after the police car disappeared from sight did he finally begin to breathe again. Frank understood clearly that every minute they remained there created another unpredictable risk, so he told Adele to go straight to the bank and withdraw nearly all of her money. But the unusual transaction immediately raised suspicion among the employees. Adele was so nervous she could barely form a sentence, which only made the bank manager more concerned. At that moment, Henry quickly offered an explanation, and his innocent answer made the staff laugh. In the end, they allowed Adele to withdraw the money she needed. Sometimes the truth makes the most convincing cover story. While Adele was away from home, Evelyn unexpectedly returned. She said a pipe had broken at her house, and asked to borrow some of Adele's tools. The moment she saw Frank at the door, she found the unfamiliar man deeply suspicious. She nervously stepped back. Frank forced himself to remain calm, and quickly explained that he was only there to make repairs. Evelyn noticed the packed luggage inside, and asked whether Adele was preparing to leave. Frank gave her only a vague answer, saying he did not know what Adele had planned. Despite her repeated questions, he continued insisting that he was just a repairman. As soon as Evelyn left, Adele and Henry hurried home. By then, Frank was nearly frantic. He knew they had almost no time left, and that his identity could be exposed at any moment. The three of them had to leave immediately. But at that decisive moment, the piercing sound of police sirens rose in the distance, growing louder and closer by the second. Adele panicked completely, and repeatedly urged Frank to run while he still had the chance. But Frank shook his head, because he knew that if he escaped alone, Adele and Henry could be charged with harboring a fugitive. To keep them from being treated as accomplices, Frank picked up the rope one final time, and tied them up to recreate the scene of a kidnapping. He moved quickly but carefully, making sure not to hurt them. Then Frank quietly told Henry, whom he had come to think of as a son, "Even if this costs me another 20 years, those few days with you and your mother would still have been worth it." His words carried his deepest, most honest feelings, and his determination to bear every consequence alone. Frank looked at Adele and Henry for a long moment, hiding every trace of longing in his eyes, then firmly turned and walked out of the house. He surrendered without resistance, accepting the punishment so they would not be charged as accomplices. The moment the police took Frank away, Adele and Henry felt as though their world had collapsed. They stood there numb, barely able to hear the people around them trying to offer comfort for escaping and for the alleged kidnapping. Frank received many additional years in prison. The man who had risked everything for only a few days of warmth and belonging was sent back behind cold prison walls. Adele never wanted to give up on him. She went to the prosecutor and insisted that Frank had not held them against their will during the final days, and that she had chosen to leave with him. But the prosecutor warned her that admitting she had willingly hidden Frank could cost her custody of Henry. To protect her son, Adele was forced to remain silent. Afterward, she wrote Frank again and again, and repeatedly tried to visit him in prison, but every attempt failed, because Frank was transferred between facilities, and his communication was restricted. The letters and visits gradually came to an end. It was not because Frank had stopped loving her, but because he did not want Adele to face further legal danger because of her connection to him. As a result, the two lost contact for many years. Time moved quietly forward, and nearly 2 decades passed. The young and uncertain Henry grew into a man, using the baking skills Frank had taught him. Henry slowly built a career of his own, and became a successful baker. He opened his own bakery, where the most beloved item was a peach pie filled with the warmth of his childhood, and a longing that had never faded. It was the recipe Frank had taught him, and the most precious memory Henry carried with him. Then one day, Henry received an unexpected letter. The instant he recognized the handwriting, his eyes filled with tears. The letter was from Frank. He wrote, "Dear Henry, I hope you still remember me. We spent that Labor Day weekend together, and those 5 days were the best of my life. I have always wondered what kind of man you became, and what you look like now." Then one day, I saw a familiar peach pie in a newspaper article, and immediately knew it had to be yours. I am truly proud of you. If you do not want to answer, I will completely understand, but I will soon be released. I am not a young man anymore, though my health is still good. I still remember the life we once planned, and the home the three of us almost had. Your mother may have remarried by now, but if she is still alone, there is something I need to ask. Would it be all right if I wrote to her? I promise, I will never bring any more pain into your lives. The honesty and hope in every line left Henry overwhelmed with emotion. The warm days they had shared, and every moment Frank had protected him, remained among the memories he treasured most. Henry wrote back immediately, and told Frank that Adele had never truly forgotten him. She still lived in the same old house, and Frank's place in her heart had never disappeared. On the day Frank was finally released, outside the prison gates, a woman had been quietly waiting for him. It was Adele. She was older now, with lines at the corners of her eyes, and streaks of silver in her hair. No longer the young woman she had once been, but in Frank's eyes, she was still the woman who had once captured his heart, and made him willing to risk everything. When their eyes met, everything they wanted to say dissolved into an emotional silence. All those years of faithful waiting had finally found their way home. Three broken souls had met by chance, and slowly healed one another through the simplest acts of daily life. A peach pie, a few household repairs, and one quiet dance had created the warmest image of home they had ever known. Frank was not a perfect man, but he still chose tenderness and protected Adele and Henry. Adele had once been fragile and closed off, but love gave her the courage to open her heart. Henry had once been young and afraid, but with their support, he learned what courage meant. Those few warm days became a light in the darkest part of their lives, a way out for people who had nearly drowned in grief, and a home for three lonely souls. True redemption does not mean erasing the past. It means choosing kindness and responsibility for the people you love. A real family is not defined by blood alone, but by finding someone who understands your wounds, and is willing to protect you to the very end. After 5 happy days, Frank returned to prison for nearly 20 years, while Adele spent those years holding on to their love. Both had once reached the lowest point of their lives, but in the end, love gave them a new beginning. Love cannot erase every consequence, but it can bring light to the darkest years, and help broken hearts find hope again.